These last 5 minutes will show everyone the areas of age and incompetence that have come to my computer, if not to me. I think what I want to do in this session is to tell stories, really. My work experience overwhelmingly during my working life was as an intermediary between people producing research and policymakers in government. I ran a national body in the field of adult education, highly marginalised area of public policy. And at its simplest, my job was to get up every morning and say, and adults, in a way that made it sound fresh and interesting and different to government. And the lessons from that I found when I moved into academic work was that, I mean, to be honest, the issues around impact and influence involve very different kinds of forms of communication than the disciplines that work best for the ref, although oddly, there's an enormous coming together of the point of the sorts of things you need to put into an abstract or into the first paragraph of your research document, much the same set of principles as you have to think about when you're trying to brief someone to act on the things that you've that you know. Can we go on to the next slide, Deborah? I'm not sure if she can hear me. Can you use the next slide? Oh, I can ask for it. Wonderful. There we are. So in this session, I want to say something about quantitative evidence, something about qualitative, stress the importance of distilling what you've learned into good stories and using learners or users' experience, what kind of partners you might use, what kind of advocacy strategies work, what the kind of barriers are. And the broad principles I would want to say are you do dispassionate analysis, passionate advocacy, and have a sense of who you're talking to. So right at the start, I thought if you could just for 1 minute or 2 minutes, write down something where related to your research, where you would like to see some area, local, national, international, of public policy changing, and to think about what role your research can play in changing that, just to jot down 1 or 2 thoughts on it. And then, you know, as we go through the session, you can use that as a kind of nonsense detector in the inappropriateness of the things that I'm going to say in the session, if that's all right. So what kind of research will help gather evidence? What kind of information works with decision makers of all kinds, whether that's teachers in a classroom or colleagues in a scientific research seminar, or policymakers at local, national, international level. And then once the session's over, if you found it useful, could you do a plan on what you'll do to act on it? If you could do that, that would be great. I need the next slide. I don't seem to. While you're writing them down. Deborah, can you put the next slide on? Thank you. Will you do that? I'll ask you each time. I think that's the easiest way.
Yes, that's fine.
So I don't, can we go back one? Can you go back one?
I think there might be a slight time delay.
Okay, that's fine. All right. Well, while you're writing, I'll carry on with the obvious point that very few of us have the impact with our research that Alec Jeffreys had with identifying DNA, where you could see there was a research impact on policing, anthropogeny, biology, medicine, migration, on squabbles about whose parents you've got, on family history, on digging Richard III up and finding out it was him and not some other random group of bones, and more things too. So next slide, please. An early point to make is that it's great to do good research. I mean, the climate science research is really powerful, but to make it beat on people's pulses and build a momentum of change, you need good advocates too. And obviously, Greta Thunberg's a really good illustration of that. Advocates, though, need good evidence accessibly presented, and that's the core of what I'm going to say. Can we have the next slide? And this slide about to come is to illustrate, if it's going to come, is to illustrate the value of technicolor language. In the middle of this is this is from a House of Lords report, and it quotes me saying, if you tried to design the decline of adult learning opportunities in Britain over the last 15 years, you'd struggle to do it as well as we've done it by accident. And that's used as a chapter heading. Well, you could have made the point very much more calmly, moderately, in a qualified way, and it wouldn't have got used. So technicolor language isn't the sort of thing we mostly encourage in the initial writing of a good research report. But if you want somebody to pay, I mean, you just have to think about, this is not said in a positive way, but the technicolor language Boris Johnson uses does get people's attention. While I wouldn't encourage any of you to become like Boris Johnson, it's a point, I think. Hello. Can I have the next slide? Well, whilst we're doing that, I might point out that the reason I chose this slide is, I suppose for 35 years I've been arguing why we don't make better provision for adults, and to ask who isn't there, and to pursue an argument about social equity and social justice with it. The next slide is shows in a graphic way with the decline of FE apprenticeships overall, that the collapse in adult participation in FE and skills over 10, 12 years was dramatic. Actually, if it was brought up to date, it would fall off a cliff from there. If we could have the next slide. So graphs are useful, but then they don't always tell the whole story. And that's what the next slide should show you. Hello.
I have changed this slide.
Thank you. But they don't always. This is the list of daily new deaths in the United Kingdom, based on what the government says, which is the point at which they said that the 8th of April was the peak of deaths. But of course, they're only deaths in hospital. And as the FT has been saying, the overall numbers are something like twice that. And you get a kind of curious public discourse if the graphs mislead the overall picture, because you end up making policy that isn't there. So you've got to work on making sure that your story, if you're going to use quantitative evidence and demonstrate it, actually does the business that you want it to do. My next slide is a picture of Albert Einstein. Can we change the slide? And in this, he says, not everything that counts can be counted. and not everything countable counts. I mean, in fact, don't think he did say it, but it's always attributed to him. It was written by a man called Campbell about 20 years after Albert Einstein died, actually, but I carry on using Einstein's picture for the same sort of impact point I've been trying to make. The dilemma is, not all the things that you can count are easy to draw attention to, and that means that all those things which are more complex risk becoming invisible. And Aaron Benevart, who ran the Global Monitoring on Education report, makes it very clear that all those things like values and team working and creativity that are difficult to capture become less visible, and then policymakers ignore them, which is one reason why Richard Layard developed a tool for measuring happiness, thinking governments weren't paying enough attention to whether people were enjoying their lives, and came up with some pretty robust happiness measures. Okay, if we could go on to the next slide, I'm going to talk a bit more in detail about the kind of evidence that was involved in the work I've done in trying to secure an impact. There's a very long-standing in adult education picture of an interest in who participates, who doesn't, what might be the reasons that the kind of public provision, private provision isn't accessible to people. So 53 reports said why this apathy. Then can I go on to the next slide? So the government funded inquiry, ACASE, did a number of studies in the 80s, and then from 1990 onwards, the organization I ran did annual reports, and a number of which I've highlighted here. And the reason we produced them was because the government produced a report ahead of the 1991-2 legislation saying there's no such thing as adult education. It's all FE, and we don't need to worry about anything that isn't certificated. So over a 30-year period, those kind of research reports have been used as a tool for advocacy. They involve representative sampling of the population in large enough numbers to be able to do effective subcategory splits so that you can see what happens with people with disabilities, the difference between Black minority ethnic participation in general, and some social class issues. The importance for this is, if I can crudely illustrate it, is that once they began debating the issues in Parliament in 91-2, and have been doing, as I'll show you, at fairly regular times since, what you get is a presenting prejudice, and research's function is to try to overcome that. So at the beginning of this debate, people said people don't want to pay for tap dance, for flower arranging on the taxes. Can we go on to the next picture? So our participation research showed, hello, can we change the slide, Deborah? Our participation survey identified the Matthew principle. People that broadly, you know, so the posher you are, the more likely you were to be taking part in any kind of learning, formal, non-formal, or informal. And that if you go on, can we have the next slide? Where you can see DE are working class and retired people. A's and B's are posh people in professional managerial jobs. This next one shows participation by age. So the older you get, the less you do. And certainly after 55, participation or people's sense of your participating declines. Can we show the next one? And Deborah, thank you. And again, the next. That's it. Now, not only is there a pattern, and you see it across employment, unemployment, I could have shown you 20 slides of who participates and who doesn't, but when you look at future intentions to learn by learning status, the people who say they've done no learning since they left school, more than 8 in 10 of them will tell you they're no intention of learning in the next 3 years either, whereas almost everybody, or 77 out of 100 of current learners, expect to be learning. Now, if you put that picture against the ILO saying there has to be a universal right to learn, or the argument of the United Nations that no one should be left behind, and you can see there's a fairly graphic illustration of a challenge about how you get to the issues of people who do or don't participate. I said, can we see the next slide? Next slide, please.
It has changed.
Lovely, thank you. The aim here, relating back to the purposes of the session, is how do you change the metaphor? Well, firstly, those figures I've shown you were produced to be able to say that learning isn't equally accessible to everybody, and there is an equity issue in it. But since they'd argued that people don't want to pay for flower arranging on the taxes, as part of our work in trying to reverse the intention of cutting out all liberal adult education, we found a Brixton florist who'd been a merchant banker and had gone for industrial retraining to an evening class in Brixton, and then had hired half the other people in the class and opened a glorious flower shop just where the 1990s riots in Brixton took place. And we found a journalist from The Independent who came down and wrote his story up. And the point of this anecdote is within three weeks, they were saying in Parliament, of course, we know flower arranging can lead to floristry. Now, influence and impact, in part, why did we look for that story? Well, the story was the kind of things that we were publishing in Veronica McGivney's Education for Other People, but translated into a popular story. Can we move on? At the same time, we thought we needed a much broader vehicle. I have to say they did reverse the policy quite dramatically, because we managed to persuade the National Federation of Women's Institutes, that had 9,000 branches, to encourage all the branches to write to say how important adult education was to them. And most members of most branches wrote, and the government had to take on 200 people short term to answer the letters. People were often writing to their husbands, and the policy was reversed within 4 weeks. So it can work if you get a combination of factors going for you: good allies, good stories, and some solid research behind it. So we then thought, well, we better create a festival for this stuff, which is invisible, and published our research findings. We used Press for Learners stories, which were building the kind of research evidence into case studies, if you like, looked at innovative practice. We got broadcasters involved and a telephone helpline. And sometimes the best research evidence comes serendipitously. We were funded by the European Union Social Fund, European Social Fund, who didn't accept that BBC broadcasts at prime time were reaching only the audience that we were aiming for, who were non-participating adults, saying a lot of the people who would get this wouldn't count. And there's a European audit principle of no pollution, which is you can't spend European money on people who it's not intended for. So how you solve the problem? We persuaded the then Department of Employment to put a piece of paper in every gyro check, every unemployed person in the country's gyro check, and we created a free telephone helpline. And with the first week that we ran, we generated 55,000 calls, and of the 60% of the participants had taken up a course or got a job within 3 months. So the research, the vivid research evidence that's thrown up, we'd never have looked for if the European Union would have accepted our numbers on broadcasting. So what I'm sort of saying is be opportunist as well. Along the way, you think there's a problem in the way statistics get collected, in that nearly all public statistics stop at 64, and people carry on learning, of course, much longer. So with a minister in 2001, we agreed to find the oldest learner in the country. If I could have the next slide. So it's Fred Moore, who was 108, and who was studying French and art in a nursing home in Hampshire. And of course, he illustrated the enormous richness and diversity of learning. We had a party in the house of in the Department of Education as another way of broadcasting our research evidence about the value of learning in later life, by having the oldest learner from each of the 9 regions of England, and also the most adventurous person over 100 in terms of curriculum they were studying. Wonderful party. And I got in a taxi afterwards to go to another event, and the taxi driver said, when I told him about it, he said, doesn't he know yet he's not going to be Picasso? 108, long pause. Well, he's twice as old as me and got more gumption. Now, if one of your functions is to try to encourage a wider public to join in learning, Fred's story was a good one to use, as was the poster. Can I have the next slide? Change slide, please.
It has.
Okay, we asked a group of London school children what lifelong learning represented to them, and they said, they did drawings and said it's beautiful, fun, awesome and cool. So we turned it into a poster for the underground. The idea that learning is fun and that lifelong learning involves children as well as adults was something that we were able to illustrate the research we'd done with this fairly vivid picture. So, I mean, kind of what I'm saying is the tools of third-rate advertising or of media savviness are of use to us. But oh gosh, it says Deborah's waiting in the lobby. Let's hope she's still here to turn on my next slide, please. Hello. Hello. Oh, good. So arising from all of this, there's also a key issue about how can you use solidly existing databases rather than having to invent everything up from scratch yourself. We persuaded the government to establish a research centre for the wider benefits of learning because of the evidence we'd had over a decade of campaigning, how hard people found it to recognise the wider impacts learning has, the things, to go back to Einstein and Benevot, that aren't so easy to measure. There's British birth cohort studies from the 40s, the 50s and 1970, in which all of the children born in a single week get re-interviewed every 5 to 7 years through their lives. We asked a series of questions, colleagues asked a series of questions when learners were in their mid-30s and talked to them again when they were 42. And what you guarantee here is an ability to have a control of the people who say they've done no learning with the people who've done it. And we found that engaging in learning of any sort, at any level of complexity, prolongs your active citizenship when you're older. It inhibits the onset of Alzheimer's, and what happens there in parallel research is that you can go round the Alzheimer's with your more active neural networks for much longer, so that you're able to carry on a life with your family and friends. And then I suppose you die faster when it finally shows itself. Nobody goes to a French class to give up smoking, but learners are 13% more likely to give it up. There was, for people who'd done a couple of classes, there was an 83% in racial tolerance. It's because the group effects of learning together diminish an anxiety about difference. It's dramatic figures. And apparently as we get older, we become more politically cynical, but people who carry on learning become politically cynical at a slightly slower rate than others. And that the evidence seemed to be that learners are less dissatisfied with their lives than others. There's a wonderful chart of Tom Schuller's which shows that life gets worse between 25 and 42, and then it gets better every year for the rest of your life. Can I show the next slide? The importance of those findings, the next slide will show. Next, yeah. Doesn't work on mine. Is that they hold whatever the prior education of learners and whatever the social class of learners. That's just not true of most things. If you look at who does well at A-levels, who does well in degrees, who does well in doctorates, you can tell by prior education and social class a good deal about predicting success rates. In these impacts, the wider benefits of learning happen whatever your background and whatever your prior learning. Well, those are kind of illustrations of things you can do once you've got the quantitative data at your disposal. Can we go on now and look at qualitative studies, please? Educations for Other People, we produced to highlight not only are there common barriers for people who don't join in learning to study, but also those specific to particular groups of people. So if you like, travellers have quite different sets of challenges to people in a residential home, people, working class adults, the interplay of social class and educational activity, early school leaving and so on, you're able to demonstrate. And the rest of those slides really show that over a 20-year period, we're making sure that as well as producing quantitative data, we were producing sector-specific or target group-specific findings that would inform public policy discussion and reinvigorate a debate about adult learning. Now, I suppose the broader picture of this is each of your own pieces of research, if you can connect them with other people's activity and over a period of time build a powerful case, the influence on public policy is a good deal easier over time to secure. Now, there's another task for you, but I won't leave a long time for you to do it. It's just to think about, for the next slide, is what kind of allies would you need to win a policy change in the public domain? And I suppose because of time, I'll just go straight on to 2 slides on, if you don't mind, Deborah. Thinking about who you might want to help get your research into having an impact upon policy. If we go on to the next slide, I'll I'll skip giving you participation rates. You can ask hard questions when I stop. Deborah?
There is a bit of a time lag. I have gone to the next slide.
Oh, okay, sorry. I need to be patient. So, I mean, the ones I thought about is if you're trying to change policy at a political level, nationally, you'd need to think about what you'd say to ministers, to people in the opposition, to select committee members, to House of people in the Lords, to special advisors like Dominic Cummings, to representatives of political parties. All of those people are involved in a discourse. And of course, they're also influenced by what happens in local government. And you can see a similar parallel there. I mean, all of those people in politics are going to be influenced by what journalists and broadcasters have to say. So you'd think, how can I get the message into them as well? Think tanks tend to shape a lot of policies. So briefing think tanks about the research that you've done and the implications of it, trade associations, professional bodies, and a specialist press. Particularly important, civil society organizations who can sometimes behave eccentrically or in headline grabbing ways to help draw attention. You just think of Occupy sitting on the doorstep of St. Paul's to see that you can get things done with flair alongside the academic production. Businesses, trade unions. Critical issue is people who are affected by the policy change that you're concerned with. Celebrity champions make a big difference. Then you think about all of those people. How am I going to reach them with my research paper? What kind of translation job am I going to need to do? Like the next slide, if I might. And I mean, critically, they're not going to read a 400-page research paper or a 30-page journal article. I mean, your colleagues and peer group are, and they're critical allies too. But I just thought it was useful here. Used to have this on the wall of my house, an Oxfam poster. Until the lions have their own historians, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunters. And the point I think I'm leading on to make is that if you can get the impact, the issues of your research, particularly if it's social policy involved, to involve the participants in it, it will have more impact, and their telling of their story will absolutely change things. Can I show an illustration with the next slide? So this one and the next one, adults with learning difficulties who together created a charter about how they wanted to be treated as an issue of how you thought about equality and diversity, the right to speak up, to go to classes, to have support, to chance to make friends and so on. And then the next one is the second half of this charter, produced by a group of adults with learning difficulties nationally working together, who then took it to a range of national conferences to reinforce, of course, the research findings of development workers and policymakers who wanted to make a difference. The right not to be bullied. I mean, these are rights everybody should be have, of course. The right to be treated with respect as an adult, clear information, good teaching, and the right to be able to do a course to get a job and to be in a nice place. Good. The next one. Can we have the next slide? I expect you've done it.
Yeah, I had. There is a bit of a time lag, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I will overshoot a little if that's all right. I mean, I could stop, but this one, if you look at the red slide here, this is something OECD's data showed that Britain has the worst literacy outcomes for when you compare 16 and 65-year-olds. It's the only country in OECD where 16-year-old school leavers don't have any better literacy than 65-year-olds, and the comparisons there are with Germany and the States. But when you go and look at what happens at 30, what's clear is that once people find a reason to use literacy, their skills improve, and that by the age of 30, they've hit a plateau where they actually outperform the literacy skills of people in other countries. Now, you can use that data to do two stories. One, to say, how on earth can we let people enter the labour force who have not got basic skills of a higher quality? But you can also say, what is it that we could learn about how adults learn through doing things in the world of their work? Okay. The next slide is, I think we can dance past fairly quickly, is a story of Alan Johnson, who's a much admired minister, saying that people wanted plumbing, not Pilates, in their so that's what we should spend our money on. Tai Chi may be hugely valuable to people, but not to other people. Not to. We found a plumber who said that up to the age of 40, plumbers don't take on apprentices, but when it's difficult to get under the bath, they do. But he didn't need to because he did Pilates classes. The point to make is you can use things people say to against them. Then this slide, Vince Cable, who was Secretary of State, has such powerful stories about his own mother's regaining or maintaining of sanity after a period in a mental hospital through adult education, that if you can use a celebrity or a powerful person, so much the better. Because you'll get the slides, I've put the next slide is just a link to a story on YouTube around incontinence pads. It deals with learning in retirement homes, and in the YouTube story, a woman says that in their care home there's been a 75% reduction in the use of incontinence pads since classes were introduced. Of course, that's a wonderful, simple statistic. I told our minister of this. A week later, a minister in another department, the other end of the country, was standing up and saying, we know learning in retirement homes works because we see a massive reduction in the use of incontinence pads. Okay, I'm going to move on now to exactly to what are the distilling skills about advocacy and influencing. Banging drums for attention, making sure people hear you. Mobilizing learners or users, asking who isn't there, who isn't part of the discourse, what questions aren't being asked, no more than the decision makers do. Identify new ways of communicating your story, and make yourself useful to decision makers over a long period of time if you possibly can. Writing briefings, and decision makers can be journalists and colleagues in research bodies, all sorts. Make yourself indispensable, and don't. There is a difference between politics and this kind of work in that surprise isn't a good idea. The object is to change policy over the long run. Then there's a second page of summary items here, which is that it's best if you use the language they like to use rather than the language you use. And I've been trying to use slightly technicolor language through this talk as a way of moving away from the carefulness of our academic research. It's an issue about the politics of generosity. If you're flexible, if you recognise other people's needs and when in doubt, give in the long run, people treat you better and you get more back, the more gets given back to you. Identify, support and celebrate allies. It's really important to say how wonderful other people are. Short-term compromise, long-term intransigence, and overall partnership, passion and patience. Now, my last 3 slides are about writing for wider publics. And they're just little reminders, even journal articles. Most people don't read to the end of newspaper articles, let alone journal articles. So make sure you summarize your argument in the first paragraphs. And the journalist's advice, say who, what, when, where, why, and who. It's not, I've written why twice, matters. And it works actually for the ref too. If you think that people have only got 20 minutes per text to look at on average, the more you get your point across at the beginning, the better. Short sentences or a combination of short and long ones. Use your active voice, so she hit him, not he was hit by her. Once you've made the broad point, illustrate it with the kind of human interest story I've been trying to share with you, a technicolor quote, key research facts, and where you can, link your writing to a theme of current public concern, like student fees, migration, austerity, COVID-19. So the conclusion I want to make is you need to do, you need to influence people, a combination of qualitative and quantitative research. You need good storytelling, you need patience, persistence, and a combination of dispassionate analysis and passionate advocacy. And to be honest, you need more competence than I've demonstrated today in the use of support materials. So thank you.
I've been checking the questions in another computer. There hasn't been any yet. So, Richard just popped up and said, how do you find balance between quotes, sound bites, the benefits of policy, influence, and the need to ensure that research isn't dining out on a vignette, which might be an outlier?
Shall I, can I give you an example, Alan? I'll just jump in really briefly. Sorry to interrupt, Professor Sir.
Wonderful.
Nice to see you. An example from my work, and I'm going back a decade now, was when a young person, I was in a focus group about physical education and its perceived outcomes, and I think they told me what I wanted to hear. And they turned around and said, PE makes you a better person.
Yeah.
Which you think, well, I'll write that one down because I'll be able to use that. But actually, when it came to the end of all of the focus groups, that was an absolute outlier. It was a soundbite, it was a powerful one, but it wasn't representative of the work. And I suppose there's a tension there for me around some of your idea around emotive language and in front of politicians and policymakers. How do we be strict on ourselves to make sure that what we're putting in front of them is a fair representation of the whole body of work?
No, I think, I mean, it's a really good question. And you can't use emotive stories like that to distort. I mean, we are researchers. We've got an ethical discipline as well as a need to have an impact. I mean, to be honest, I think if I were you in that situation talking to a minister, I'd say we ran a group of focus groups. The first one, I heard exactly what I was hoping for. Someone said PE makes you a better person. But in the end, it didn't show that, because in the end, if you tell people stories that don't quite work for you, then they trust you more. We at NIAS did we asked the general public how much people should pay for classes, and the evidence was deeply unhelpful to people who are looking for more public investment, because the general public's view was the learners should pay a much higher proportion of the fees. Well, you know, you could be tempted in your outlier example, not to make as much fuss of that finding as you would of the kind of findings I've been illustrating today. But to be honest, you're more likely to be trusted on the other stories if you tell the ones against yourself too. So that's really helpful. Question.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you for that, Alan. I'm going to move on now to Sarah, but thank you very much for your words of wisdom, and I'm sure we'll all agree that they were very, very useful. So another question has popped up in the text box. So Alan, if you could respond to that by text, I'd be most grateful.
Fine.
And I'll hand over to Professor Sarah Hayes, who's going to be talking to delivering a presentation. If you'd like to introduce yourself, Sarah, I'll switch my mic off.
Actually, Deborah, I don't have my slides appearing. I just attempted to share them.
I can see them.
Are they there? I can't see them at all.
On again now.
Are they? Okay, let's have another go. So I share them, Deborah, and then I full screen them. Is that correct? I'll try. It just says stop presenting, give control. I don't seem to be seeing my slides at all here. Are you seeing them, Alan?
Yeah, we can see the.
You can. No.
Yep.
Bear with me while I try and full screen them. Does that work?
Perfect.
People can see that.
Yes.
Wonderful.
We can.
Yeah,
Thank you,
very well.
Sarah.
That's great. Can you also see me?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes,
we can
good.
see you in the bottom of the.
I can see one person who has their video on and it's not me, but that's fine. Anyway, I'd just like to say hello to you all and many thanks for coming along, and also just to thank Deborah for setting this up, because it's really great to be able to talk alongside Alan. I've really enjoyed his talk and I'm looking forward to Bazina's afterwards. What I will just say is that some people who are here and present this afternoon may have seen some of these slides that I'll be putting up, particularly if they attended my inaugural. But let's actually think about them in this new and very strange context that we're in at the moment, where, you know, we're in very deeply challenging, strange times we haven't experienced in the pandemic lockdown still, as we, you know, sit here talking about policy. And as you can see from my title, I'm actually asking the question, who does higher education policy actually work for? But as we look at some linguistic examples, I'd also like us to be considering the wider, you know, sort of broader picture of cultural change that sits around that. So moving on to just think about this COVID context, we hear a lot about the idea of a new normal at the moment. So quite what that is, people are beginning to question in the higher education policy context. So even in Wonky this week, if people know of Wonky, the higher education policy authors are asking questions like, if there's no going back, how do we get forward to a new normal? And that was Jim Dickinson. And then also Alan is asking here, what could we lose actually in the transition to a new normal? And I think these are great questions to be asking at the point when many of us are conducting a lot of activities as academics online and not in our usual way. But at the same time, even though they're very important considerations, I wonder if we could also question a little bit about the, bear with me a second, I can't quite see my slide because of the video that's on. But anyway, I'll continue to talk if it's covered up a little bit. This idea of dropping a new normal into an existing policy making background and policy writing background, we tend to have this idea that policy just stays the same in terms of the processes that we use, that it doesn't change that much, that, well, that's the way that we do policy and the way that we produce documents for different strategies. But maybe we should actually be thinking much more about interrogating the way that we do that and what that might need to be replaced by when so much is changing around us. So just draw your attention to an interesting article by a colleague of mine in Croatia with, it's Peter Jandrik, he's written with Peter McLaren and Michael Peters. And the article called Viral Modernity has some interesting points on how we actually understand our fusion of living beings alongside technological systems. And Peter writes, writes a lot with myself as well. We write about post-digital theory. And he's in this article, they talk about bioinformation in the social world, and they look at the virus in the context of all of these other things like infodemics and bioinformational paradigms. So I'm just simply mentioning that at this stage because it may be something that we come back to a little later when we try and contextualize this in our current circumstances. So I'll just move on to give you a bit of an overview of what the talk really is about. And this is, we have this emphasis on participation that we've heard brilliantly from Alan about all of his work over the years in encouraging adult participation and lifelong learning. But you can ask, how inclusive is the way in which we're writing these policies for this kind of activity? And so what I have done is I have written a book which I'll be telling you more about, and I've done a bit of a few years really of corpus-based critical discourse analysis, and I've looked at millions of words of policy during the last few years, and what I've noticed is some real patterns of repetition that I'm afraid I've rather sort of unreverently perhaps dubbed McPolicy. And this is in the context of George Ritzer's work. So I noticed something called nominalization, which again, some people may know a lot more about nominalization if they're linguists, and I'm not a linguist, I'm really a sociologist by background. But this nominalization, as the patterns appeared to me in policy analysis, they are very reminiscent of George Ritzer's comments about McDonaldization in wider society. Now, just to say, in case there are people who are not aware of exactly what McDonaldization theory refers to, it's really when society begins to adopt the sorts of characteristics of a McDonald's or a fast food restaurant, a Starbucks, this kind of thing, tending to be offering the same brands, the same sorts of experiences. And this is something that Ritzer writes about in Augmented, as well as material situations, so things that happen online as well. And, you know, we can see how this is mirrored online. So what I'm suggesting really is that what's happening in the policy language is not unlike McDonaldization, is not unlike a linguistic form of Ritzer's theory. So we're sort of seeing collections of words that almost appear to have replaced staff and students, rather like the automation that we're seeing in society through industries where we're now seeing routine tasks replaced by automated ways of doing this, artificial intelligence, robotics, these kind of things. And then in the higher education policy, you're almost seeing certain buzz phrases that through the verbal constructions and the way in which these are written, you could almost imagine they're performing tasks for us too. So give this a little bit of a thought in terms of your own experience of policy language, and ask yourself, well, if we are doing this to the extent that I'm noticing, is it at all possible that perhaps rather than changing things for the better, we might be reinforcing certain inequalities? And particularly if we're diminishing the human presence that so many of our students and collaborators would value in universities. So if you've got access to the chat box and you want to be thinking a little bit about some questions to ask later, do also share any words or phrases that give you discomfort so that we can talk about them, and have a little think too about how current life is making you feel in terms of visibility or not. Because one of the things I would put to you is that we do seem to be diminishing a little bit as humans in an awful lot of contexts, and how we bring that humanity back into our working and learning and teaching contexts is something that's concerned me for some time. And particularly now as we look beyond the COVID-19, we're seeing so many more testimonies from people who are bringing to light these deeply emotional challenges they're facing in this context when they're trying to live and work as academics or students. So that would be good to come back to. What I'd like to do now is ask you the question, which is at the beginning of these slides. Who do you think university policy actually works for? And again, quite important perhaps during this situation of crisis management that we find ourselves in. So firstly, I often will ask this of groups, and I will hear from people, you know, in the room with me, as opposed to in all the locations where you are, all of these sorts of answers. They will generally suggest things like, well, we hope it's working for some of the people that you can see listed here. And so if you think about it, these are all human beings. These are people, whether they're in marketing departments, whether they're senior managers, they're all people who, you know, would make part of the university. That in itself is interesting when you look in the language and you see how little there is an explicit mention of these people. And the second thing to point out as well is that often people will raise the concern that they're asked to write a policy, but they don't necessarily have a lot of experience. So they will take a policy from another institution, create copies of certain parts of that, hopefully not plagiarize the whole lot. And what happens then is we begin to amplify the same sorts of patterns that I have been noticing. So I've mentioned here the book that I wrote and published last year, and really this was bringing together a number of different analyses of different types of policies. I'll tell you a little bit more of about that as we go forward. What I'll do now is just share a little bit of wider context around this book. So it's called The Labour of Words in Higher Education, and it's clearly written with an assumption that neither technology nor policy discourse itself can be considered as neutral. So think of them much more as embedded and connected in the wider political economy and the ways in which things are playing out around us. Many people write about marketisation in higher education and how we respond to the demands of capitalism, but we're doing this often through some new technological platforms. And Alexander Means has written about the fact that we're really responding almost in education to a form of on-demand learning that is rather like the gig economy, and the kind of ways in which we've changed from being a broader place of knowledge to very much meet demand in this way. And then Ben Williamson, who has written a lot about platform capitalism, he talks about the risks of data-led management and making so many of our decisions by data, which might overshadow some of the human narratives, which just towards the end of his talk, Alan was mentioning, that were so powerful in terms of storytelling. And then Biesta points to a new language of learning as economic exchange, and that might again strike a chord with some people. And just finally to mention Dennis Hayes and Catherine Eccleston's work on therapeutic culture, because what you have really in that sort of approach is that we're very much fostering dependence, perhaps. Some people would say students are much more dependent than perhaps you know, they used to be. Maybe that's something that is necessary, but we can question whether as humans generally in society we're fostering this therapeutic culture alongside losing our visibility or becoming more obscure as other technological things take over. Just to point out that Dennis Hayes is no relation, by the way. He's not a dad or a brother or a partner. He's a professor of education at Derby. And now let me actually just mention, sort of leading into some of the analysis that I've done. noticed that many of the policies actually respond rather to individual isolated issues rather than perhaps the connectivity that we need now in the sort of context that we're in. So we tend to educationalise particular social problems into university policy or schools policies. And they're not necessarily new agendas. They can often be just badged under a new form of buzz phrase or some kind of repetition that starts then that requires us to respond to phrases like the student experience, student engagement, as you can see quite a few other examples. And if these relate to work that staff have already always really done with their students in their various learning or supportive contexts in universities, we're now seeing policies that raise these as, again, particular issues. And we're also seeing iconography around university campuses where, often we will have some of these phrases also printed onto big posters or boards. And this one in particular, if you look at it, you could think, well, it's really important. It's about promoting student well-being. It's an important topic. But the way in which this is phrased is very much about promoting a buzz phrase called student well-being and not particularly illustrative of the diversity of the student body, of individual student needs. And those are met by the people who work with them rather than a buzz phrase called student well-being. Lots and lots of repeated statements like this in policy kind of give us the impression that we could be actually, maybe inadvertently, but subcontracting our academic labour to these non-human buzz phrases. And of course, there's the side that's, it's not really that empowering for us if you put it alongside other ways in which we might be becoming less visible as human beings in wider society. Now, just to give you an example of that, here's some visible human displacements that you'll recognise. And some of these we've actually taken quite well, really. We found them quite convenient because we can call our own lifts and we can make our own phone calls, we can run our own movies at home, and that seems to be fine. However, there are people that have lost jobs from these various scenarios, but still we're operating this technology. We feel like, at least in part, it's in our control. We may not understand how it works, but we believe that we're the ones that are in charge of it. And that may be debatable, but here's another example in the university context. Perhaps we don't mind the visibility of ourselves being replaced by these rather attractive canines that even have their own ID cards. We've identified who they are. If they bark inappropriately, we can, we can follow that up. So we don't mind those sorts of displacements either. However, there's also some less visible human displacements that are going around a lot at a great rapid pace now. And we're becoming used to being surveyed by algorithms online. We're getting used to the fact that suggestions are made to us about our shopping. We have algorithms that can review criminal records. And so what you have here is work going on in the background where it might amplify human weaknesses. It might also save people's lives because health risks can be spotted, suicide rates, perhaps suicide risks. So you're looking at algorithms actually being able to work as such, but not being accountable. And to just say also, of course, they're not neutral. These are programs that have been written and placed, and again, in the context that that surrounds us. So these are not unlike buzz phrases, but they are a different form of taking away human agency, and they also present challenges for us. So sort of moving back a little bit towards the linguistic analysis now. In policy texts, we can notice this displacement, as I said earlier, through nominalisation. And I'll give you an example of that now. So this is just a generic example, where if I wrote the phrase, students raised money by auctioning items for charity, you can see there that I've used the verb raised and auctioning, and it's quite clear to see that this is an action that's been enacted by students. However, I could write the charity auction raised money. And then something different has happened here. Suddenly we're actually looking at the process of auctioning becoming nominalised and wrapped up in the statement, the charity auction. And then it's the charity auction that's actually been attributed with the human labour process of raising this money. And suddenly we don't have the mention of the students. Now, I've written about this elsewhere and basically said that this is inferring that phrases or things can perform human tasks, collections of words even. And this isn't unlike the way that we actually can see these analogies in products and consider these buzz phrases to almost be like some of the products that we're also giving human capabilities to. And again, I'll give you some rather humorous examples of those in a moment. So first of all, I'm going to just mention a little bit about the analysis of this phrase, the student experience. And as you can see, it's, you will have noticed it coming up in the media a lot. This one is actually from 2015, and it says that the University of Bath offers the best student experience. And then the editor of the Times Higher said, well, one of the aims of the government's higher education reforms was to increase competition between universities and intensify the focus on the student experience. So you're actually talking about a focus on a thing. What is the student experience? And then you get the clickbait stories in the media, which are also emphasising this idea that there is a singular student experience, that universities are generic service providers. And how do individual diverse students benefit from this? So Peter Scott mentioned that the student experience was not a really familiar phrase until very recently. Now we just do this to death and we run conferences on it, but it's doubtful whether its meaning is becoming any clearer. So I looked into this in terms of corpus linguistics, first of all, and I gathered a lot of strategy documents, and I write about this in chapter 3 of the book. Now, I looked at these through software called Wordsmith, which I'm very happy to tell people more about if they would like to know about other software. They can do this kind of thing. What I should say, though, ironically, is that, and quite reflexively really, Wordsmith allows you to quantify text. It allows you to look at word patterns, numbers, and it also allows you to see concordance lines. So in a sense, I'm almost guilty of doing something that is quite rational, quite almost McDonaldized myself with these texts. But this was a sort of initial look at them, and then hopefully I can convince you that I've actually looked in a deeper analysis through critical discourse analysis. So have a look at these examples. These are just some of the statements from the concordance lines that Wordsmith will bring up. And what it does is it sorts these statements so that you can see very clearly where there are certain repetitions, and it will tell you how often a statement delivers something. So here you can see that the student experience strategy delivers the student experience ambitions of the university. That particular statement I'll take a closer look at in a moment, but have a look at number 28 there. The student experience is interpreted holistically through the verb embracing as embracing the student learning experience. And suddenly you start to have rational statements that are really almost meaningless again, because that is rather an irrational way to write about student learning experiences. And then if you look at the other ones listed there, you have that it's a strategy that will drive, or it's certain approaches that will provide, and it's again a strategy that sets out the priorities for the student experience. So let's have a little look again at the top one there on this next slide. The student experience strategy delivers the student experience ambitions of the university. So I've asked the question, what, all on its own? You know, this does sound rather like an Amazon delivery. And then it's obviously working. The strategy is at work because it's delivering. But you can ask the question, well, who is it working for? And can a strategy actually deliver anything? Don't people in universities work to deliver what happens in universities? You can also say, well, actually, the student experience ambitions of the university, should that be our main focus anyway? And don't students have ambitions, experiences of their own? And then you could also ask, well, the university, which university are we referring to? Because universities are not all the same. So why, and again, do share your thoughts on this, why do we write higher education policy as if it applies to only one generic university, when quite clearly up and down the country we are actually working differently in different contexts and different institutions? Now, in Chapter 6, I looked also at employability strategies and found statements like employability is at the heart of the university vision. So again, which university are we talking about? It's the university, but good to hear it has a vision. But then you can also ask yourself, well, isn't it people that would really have a vision? At least employability here is at the heart of this, so potentially people still have jobs. But then again, can employability in and of itself do something about the automation that's happening around us? Now I start to get a bit silly here, so forgive me, but I'm going to suggest to you that perhaps this smoothie knows an answer for us. Now, on this bottle, it says, this bottle houses a delicious smoothie, but it's got extra features that not many people know about. It has the power to perceive your deepest desires. It knows all about your trips to the fridge, your dreams of owning a racing pigeon, and it also knows that you're going to pop it in the recycling bin when it's done, because you're one of the good ones, and it can tell. So, if a smoothie can tell that we actually plan to put a bottle in the recycling bin, then maybe a strategy can actually deliver. So what actually happens here now on a couple of these slides, I'm starting to show that I got interested in supermarket shopping. I started finding products that had some of these sorts of phrases on them. Clearly I can't do this so much right now. You need to go into a supermarket during the lockdown with a certain haste. So I haven't been doing this lately. But I noticed that a lot of these higher education policy statements are marketed rather like, for example, Jamie Oliver's lovely lentils. So if you have a look at the back of a packet of lentils, when you maybe have some and decide to use those, these hearty lentils really deliver on the flavour front. So if lentils can deliver, then presumably so can a student experience strategy. However, we do need to ask ourselves whether flavour is actually at all the same thing as student experience. So there are problems that we begin to encounter when we're using the same patterns of language. Do we actually want such ambiguous policy discourse for higher education? And maybe we can consider whose interests it's serving, or if we need to rethink the way that we write some of these strategies. Moving on to something that's been keeping people very busy in universities in the last year, the writing of access and participation plans. But many of them still don't explicitly mention the people involved. So you have statements like this where a plan is working alongside another strategy, or a focus rather than the group itself is now being embedded across the university. Or we're even working towards achieving a culture of embedded data-led decision-making when we're actually working on the evaluation of widening participation activities. So just a little bit more food for thought there on those particular plans and strategies. And to question really now whether we should be asking ourselves, do some of these actually begin to cancel each other out in the wider context of social justice, widening participation and student retention, if we're actually talking about projects and technology rather than the staff and the students themselves? So in a quote from Gupta, Lerner and McCartin, they emphasise that we shouldn't really be talking rather casually about the future of work. We should much more be focusing back in on the future of workers, because it is in fact people who will ultimately preserve equality and democracy. So this seems to be particularly important when we notice in a headline last year that social mobility in the UK has been virtually stagnant since 2014. So thinking about that sort of a context, maybe we actually do need to look much more at some of the things that Gupta and Lerner and McCartin are pointing out here, so that we can plan for more sustainable higher education that is about the people that make universities. Now, just to give you one more example here, it's not only student experience strategies, we have student engagement strategies that are often as hardworking as this cup of coffee is marketed as very hardworking coffee. Here's a statement: effective student engagement offers a range of benefits to the university. So maybe we could hire student engagement then, rather than the new lecturer or the students that were coming in for our open day. And then have a little look at this example, where we have the student union and the university welcoming the essential role that student engagement plays in enhancing the quality of learning and teaching, and more broadly, the student experience. It's an awful lot for student engagement to achieve all on its own, but you can then begin to question, are we actually needed anymore, particularly when we're a little bit out of sight as we are all working from home right now. So just as some of these daily products seem to be attributed with these human characteristics, there's university buzz phrases that seem to be able to provide and contribute experiences for our students. And as you can see, there's two more examples here. And in a moment, I'll come on to technology enhanced learning, and we can look at some examples in that. But just first of all to say that university policy documents are maybe not marketed in quite such colourful language as this, as a globe-trotting, groundbreaking, gluten-free rogue that will steal your heart and your loose change, like this beer. But of course, we could wonder if some of these buzz phrases are actually even in some kind of representation, taking over what we do, failing to credit us with what we do. So if that's the case, and then we're being omitted, we could maybe just start to drink vagabond beer, because this actually suggests that it's nomadic beer for a displaced generation, which seems particularly apt. But going back to being a little bit more serious again, we can actually consider whether this form of nominalisation even has some similarities to technological determinism. So a lot of strategies that we have seen for technology in relation to learning in universities over the last 20 years, I've listed a number of them down the side here. They've tended to have a bit of a deceptive form of language. And this is something that I looked at in chapter 4, because the phrase technology enhanced learning, I would say, is a rather misleading linguistic structure again. And Sian Bain, who is a professor at Edinburgh University, she says, TEL has been adopted as an apparently useful, inoffensive, descriptive shorthand for what is in fact a complex and often problematic constellation of social, technological, educational change. And I think my scrutiny of the policy found precisely this, that if anything, we're making this a very, very simplistic picture when we simply look for exchange value, that technology will automatically enhance learning. Many of us working from home right now, grappling with different technologies, are finding that there is a great deal to do before we can begin to hope to together with that technology, enhanced learning. So in the book, I provide rather a lot of examples of this particular phrase because there has been so much policy about this. But nearly half of this refers to a phrase, the use of technology. And the verbs that are put alongside this are that it will increase or it will some way promote or enhance learning. Very little mention of the people themselves who will be teaching or learning in that process. So just click a few examples here to show you. We have things like increasing accessibility, creating digital archives, enhancing productivity, enhancing learning and teaching. And all of these things are enacted here linguistically through the use of technology. As I say, it's not showing the use of technology to be in partnership with the people teaching. Now, we could begin to think together about ways that we might respond, and this is just one possibility, is that we look to post-digital theory, which acknowledges this much more hybrid, much more interconnected context that we have now with technology, that we don't see technology as coming in and saving the day. So maybe as we start to consider what a new normal is, we could consider how we might interrogate how we have understood technology in learning to this point. And I'm currently writing a new book for Brill, which is called Post-Digital Positionality in Higher Education, because I'm looking very much more at individual contexts, identity in this sort of situation, and how we actually understand positionality much more widely than simply as researchers, how we understand it as learners, as teachers, and what we need to know about the data that is being kept on us and the interactions that we're now finding are not simply with people, but are with technologies and people, things that we can't see like algorithms, etc. How we could move towards a more emancipatory discourse that captures some of that. And I'll just share with you something that Patrick Carmichael has written about post-digital co-research. And he's actually pointing to using this concept. He's written in the journal up there, Post-Digital Science and Education, that we need to challenge these dominant rhetorics and actually look to more emancipatory ways that we could perhaps use the post-digital as a counter-hegemonic educational programme. So I'm coming to the end of this now, and we can begin to have a little bit of debate about what all of this means. But I'd like to just leave you with a question. If higher education policy did in fact work for us, what might that look like instead? We could place an advert and we could say, well, wanted hardworking policy texts that put people first. And maybe for the essential criteria, we could say that we need to be writing honestly about the work that staff and students do. And maybe we could also have the understanding about us being diverse regional universities, not the university. We're certainly creative, we're varied institutions, we may even resemble this Visi Vimto. We might be as seriously mixed up as a blend of grapes, raspberries, blackcurrants. But at least this sort of drink has been around since 1908. Universities have been around longer. Maybe if we can actually think of ways that we can reoccupy policy, perhaps we'll be able to stick around for just as long. So if I could thank you very much for listening to that. Leave these questions up on the final slide, and perhaps I can now hand this back to Deborah.
Thank you, Sarah. We've got a couple of questions. The first is from Eric, and it's quite a lengthy question. So, Eric, can I invite you to just put your microphone on and quickly ask your question, please?
Well, thank you so much, Sarah and Alan. Sarah, I mean, I actually fell in love with the whole McDonaldization theory.
Yes.
And well, my research is not in the area of higher education, but I was kind of finding a way to link that up to my own research, which is seeking to question, policy making on climate change adaptation that has had this international flair, and we've got independent states, especially in Africa, copying, the blueprints that have been put in place by international policy actors on climate change. And I was asking if I could actually draw a synonym between what is happening in that process to say it's like a McDonald-like precedence that has been set at the international level that fails to actually take into consideration the specificities at the local levels in terms of knowledge, capacities, the corpus linguistic, the phrases, the words that are used at the international level that might be different at the local level. And, in my research, pushing for more consideration of those local knowledge, practices, and capacities for them to fit in, a bottom-up process as opposed to a process which is trickling down and being copied from the international level. So that's it's more of a feedback, more of a comment, and asking if I could refer to that McDonaldization theory in the work I'm doing. Yeah.
Just unmuting myself. Sorry. Yeah, I think hopefully you can hear me, Eric, and your research sounds fascinating, and I would enjoy hearing more about it, actually, because if I heard you correctly, you're saying that there seems to be this much more global focus around climate change, and that it might be potentially omitting some of the more local and voices. Is that correct? Are you still there, Eric?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Sarah, exactly. That's it. Yeah.
Yes. And what's your question about how, I'm not sure how you're analysing the policies. Have you a process that you're following at the moment?
Yeah, it's about, I'm basically focused on looking at the processes that are happening in Africa at the moment.
Yes.
They seem to have, copied or adopted what's been developed at the international level at the expense of the local understanding, the local languages, the local capacities, the local knowledge that would have otherwise informed, the understanding of, climate change and how people respond to that at local level. But it's been like, what you describe as a McDonaldization, where there's been a scaling up of those processes that have been developed at international level to with the belief that it has the same meaning for people down there at the local level. But I'm kind of challenging that whole process in my research to say those local communities need to be brought on board, get them, give their own local understanding and how that fits into the decision-making processes. So I wanted to know if the McDonaldization theory is something that one can use in his or her own work, or it's something which is still under development, a theory which is still under development.
No, I would say you could certainly refer to it. It's a long-standing theory that George Ritzer has actually developed over the years, and as I say, he's looked at augmented versions of this now. And I think he's written also a lot about globalization, which I think is very relevant for your research. And I think your research is hugely important, because what we tend to do with everything is, there's very much this reasoning that is going on in the the global north, which forgets that actually in areas of the global south you have all sorts of contributions that could actually help us rethink, if you're looking at these almost turning things around because of the dominance that you get from the more globally developed parts of the world. We need to flip that and actually start learning from some of the local voices that are telling us things that we could really, benefit from. So I think if you can surface some of those and put these into a context where we're almost flipping the globalization picture a little bit, I think that's going to be very valuable.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
And thank you for your question, Eric.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. I've noted there's another comment in the chat box from Ashley, so I'll invite you to respond to that via text whilst Bazana gives her presentation on IPA, which is a form of policy analysis. So can I hand over to you now?
Thank you, Deborah.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Right,
That's
can
great.
you see my presentation?
And yeah, your presentation's on the screen. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Right. So first thing first, thank you for invitation and everyone coming along. And I would like to just say something about Alan's and Sarah's presentation, because I think my presentation follow quite nicely from those two presentations. And so Alan showed us how research can impact policy change and how to influence really people, including using combination of methodology in order to put your point across to policymakers, for example. Sarah emphasized the use of language in education policies and, for example, use of nominalizations, attributes in policy writings, which brings me to linguistics and use of language in policy making. And such methodologies used to analyze those words and language used, like fair clause, critical policy, critical discourse analysis, sorry. And my presentation actually is directed to postdoctoral PhD students such as Eric just explained his research on climate change and policies in African countries. And in order for them to get to know specific methodology used in policy analysis, and perhaps they will feel invited to use this methodology in their work. So today I will introduce you to a methodology that you can use in order for your research to have an impact. And then I will give you an example of my study in which I used, together with my colleagues, this particular methodology when I was exploring portability of social security rights across EU countries. And this is portability of rights of EU mobile citizens or EU migrants, if you like. So I'm going to talk today about why interpretive approaches to research and analysis of policies and policy processes are experiences currently renewed interest in the social sciences by focusing on the introduction to interpretive policy analysis. I decided to focus on this particular methodology, or rather umbrella that brings several methodologies all together, as they constitute foundation, if you like, of critical approaches to policy analysis, which challenges the positivism and scientism that, believe it or not, until these days is present in policy analytic research. And this is, if I may say so, not criticism of use of quantitative research, as interpretive policy analysis can use both quantitative and qualitative methodology. It's just a criticism of the positivism and scientism as the philosophical take on how we understand world, and in this particular instance, how we understand or explore policies. However, before I will move to describe this particular methodology, I will go through several very basic, simple definitions, such as definition of political system, policy, and policy making, because this understanding of basics of those definitions will help us to then understand the shift in analysis of policies, this interpretive shift in policy analysis that IPA essentially represents. So first things first, and what is the political system as such? The political system defines process for making official government decisions, really. And in other words, we could argue that it is a coordinated set of principles, laws, and ideas that relate to particular form of governance or government through policy. And this is important because it's not only policies are not only set of rules or laws, but they include certain values that are represented in the through the policies. Values that are then being allocated, as Easton says, for a society, and often values that are in disagreement with certain parts of society or groups of society, sorry. So then, what is policy? And probably best known really and really simple short definition of public policy is the one that you can see on the slide, and it's by Thomas Guide, and it goes as follows: anything policy is anything a government chooses to do or not to do. Right?
I'm really sorry, but your slides aren't moving. So we've got a frozen slide. We're still on your introductory slide.
Right. Okay. Let's try them.
We can see them now. Thank you.
And can you see the slide now? What is policy?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
And now?
Yes,
okay.
We've got the slides. Thank you.
Thank you. Just give me a shout if anything will go wrong. So that's probably the simplest and best. Well, I don't know if it's the best, but probably best known and simple short definition of public policy. And it goes as follows: anything the government chooses to do or not to do. And also, in essence, policy is a set of ideas or a plan what to do in particular situations that has been agreed, for example, by a government or a political party or organizations that create policy. But then how those policies are created? So they're created by a policy making process. And I changed my slide. I don't know if you can see what does policy making mean.
Not yet, no.
It looks like, and now?
Yes, we can now.
Okay, so maybe I will keep it like that. I will not enlarge it, and I don't know if you can see that. Okay. Let's try like this. So then the process, the policy-making process is the process by which government translates their political vision into programs. And essentially, it is about those values that I just spoke before. So this political vision, certain values that are through policy making and in policies are imposed, if you like, on individuals or on societies. So policy can take a range of different forms, and those include intervention, non-intervention, regulations, for instance, by licensing, but a variety of different acts that can be considered a policy, including, for example, by grant aid, as well as direct public service provisions. But what we need to understand here is what public policy means before we will move on to analyzing public policy. And public policy is, in a way, one could argue, a process by which government translates their political vision, which is which are essentially those values that we spoke about before. And those values are turned into different programs and different specific policies. So what is the purpose of policy analysis there now? I changed my slide. I'm just checking. Can you see it?
Yes,
right.
We can see it.
Great, thank you. So one can then ask, where's the purpose of policy analysis as such? And the purpose of policy analysis is to address more in depth, if you like, a particular problem that is managed through the policies, to examine the arguments related to concerned policy, and to analyze those policies and the ways in which how they are implemented, but also what kind of impact those policies have, for example, on individuals or on groups. And that's really important, because then we can possibly change policies if they're working in an undesired way, or we can do those analyses beforehand in order to prepare new, enhanced, and renewed new policies. And policies, for example, they may include aspects of inclusion and exclusion, and thus may create the hierarchical orders of individual or groups. So that's why it's important to look into policies in order to see who is, if you like, benefiting from specific policies and who is not, why, and under what circumstances or what eligibility criteria, if you like. And also, in other way, you could say that policy analysis is actually a technique used in public administration to enable civil servants or activists, really, or members of societies, or to examine and evaluate the available options to implement the goals or laws and elected officials. And here we get back to those values. So basically, we can actually, through analysis of policies, check what kind of values they are carrying, and what kind of values specific governments or policymakers want to impose on individuals or groups. And here this quotation is from Aaron Davsky, and the reason why I've chosen this particular quotation is because actually Aaron Davsky was one of the founders of the Wheel of Interpretive Policy Analysis, and he was an American political scientist, really known as one of the pioneers of work in public policy from academic perspective. So there are several ways in which one could analyze policy. And I will not go into much details here because I want to focus on interpretive policy analysis. But there are evaluative policy analysis, normative policy analysis, empirical policy analysis, and comparative, cross-national, and so on policy analysis. And some of them are retrospective and some of them are prospective. So I spoke about the fact that one can look at policies, previous policies, and then what kind of impact they have, but also policy analysis may look at potential future changes in those policies in the future. So now, what is finally this interpretive policy analysis? So interpretive policy analysis is an umbrella, really, term referring to policy analysis, which analyzes both the process of policy production, so how the specific policy was produced, under what condition, in which context, and by whom and when, and policies themselves. So what those policies are carrying with itself. So basically, what kind of values those policies are representing, what they are telling us about what they try to manage, what they try to impose. And those policies are not seen just as, if you like, regulation, but as meaning making. So this production is not happening by itself, but it carries certain meaning making by policymakers and meaning bearing. That is why I wanted to introduce basic definitions that I have started with, because in interpretive policy analysis, we need to focus on this meaning making. So, and meaning creation, because each and every policymaker through policies creates a meaning, certain meaning. Let's say about education, and Sarah gave us those fantastic statistics about how education is perceived by policymakers, for example. And interpretive policy analysis strongly emphasize qualitative research methods, such as standard documentary ethnographies, discourse analysis, and this I think goes back slightly to Sarah's work in looking at language, the use of nominalities and so on, and or narrative analysis. So like one can use also not only policies themselves, but also all documents surrounding policies. So all documents, all political debates about certain policies, or interviews with policymakers, and so on. And both can be used. All of those documents can be in IPA, can be analyzed through qualitative or quantitative methodology. However, what's important here is the fact that it's unlike classical critical discourse analysis. The emphasis is on understanding the highly contextualized socio-political conditions in which policy is produced and practiced, or in which discourses and practices become policies. So you see, in IPA, we are using IPA means that we cannot look at policies without those surrounding documents. We have to always embed our analysis within context and the socio-political conditions in which those policies were created. And this is true for historical interpretive policy analysis, but also in current, if we want to interpret the current policies. And IPA research is frequently also concerned with questions of how policy becomes meaningful, because all of those policies have certain meaning behind them and certain values embedded, as we discussed earlier. And also emphasis are put on importance of context and meaning, because this context and meaning often contributes to the ways in which those policies are created and how they're introduced and what kind of impact that potentially they have had or will have. And therefore, this contextualization of socio-political conditions in which those policies were produced is so important in IPA. And according to Dvoreyanov, and she's one of the people who really developed this technology in 80s and in 90s, also is working on that today. Interpretive policy analysis starts from the assumption that policies and policy process do not address real social problems in a planned, rational, and coherent way. Therefore, this context is important because by looking at context, we are looking also at this like messiness of the policy-making process. Instead, this analysis rests on the assumption, really, that the social issues that are addressed through policymaking have different meanings for different people or groups of people or different groups of interests. And also in different times, different meaning at different times. So the engagement with this situated meanings, I use meanings and not meaning on purpose, because interpretive policy analysis looks at different meanings of policies and the process of policy making, not only on meaning. So while using IPA, we are trying to look at different types of meaning in, let's say, one policy. That it's believed that policy carries several meanings at once and not only really one. And this leads really interpretive policy analysts to ask several questions during this analysis. And they are often not really addressed, I believe, at least in other approaches. And those questions are, for example, how different perspectives that people have on an issue affect what they see, how they see it, and how they act with respect to it, as well as the intended and unintended consequences that their personal perspective has on policies and on people that those policies concern. So in other way, we are yet again closely look at those values that are embedded in those policies. It is important to just briefly say how historically IPA was developed in order to understand the difference between interpretive policy analysis and critical discourse analysis, for example. And so around 40 years ago in the United States, there was this program called Great Society. And this program basically was designed to eliminate poverty and racial injustice in the United States. And at the end of this program, the program was evaluated, and a number of policy scholars really started to question the foundation of positivist way of analyzing policies, because they've noticed that actually this Great Society program was, frankly speaking, quite useless. And although there were several policies over the years developed in this program and introduced in the United States, they really hardly have had any impact on society, especially on such a great aim as of poverty and racial injustice there. So they started really questioning the ways in which those programs were, those policies and this particular program as such was developed and what kind of policies it included. So really they picked up on this, and in opposition to this type of research and this type of policies that are really embedded in foundational social theory, the scholars challenged this positive research methods used in preparation of these policies and also of them evaluating this Great Society program. And here, just briefly, I would like to mention for our students that positivist studies alone will never provide a complete picture of an issue, and they really fail to reveal the complexity of social life. And I think we all know that, and I mean, scientists move on from positivist studies in social sciences a long time ago. But as I say, this move from positivism in policy analysis to interpretivism, which stress the understanding of the social world through an examination of reinterpretation of world and context and people's perspective on things, including on policies, was a really huge shift in the ways in which then policies were analyzed, and then also how those analyses were used in policy making, and how policy analysts who used this interpretivist way of analyzing policies had an impact on policies themselves. That was a mouthful, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. So those American political scientists, and this includes Aaron, whom I cited before, observed the inability really for facts and to settle policy controversies in some sense. So they were really receptive to the role of language in policy debates, although they looked at language as well. But they argued that we need to use more, we need to go further and use of metaphors used in context and different narratives around policy making, not only policies, in order to understand policy issues and represent them further down. So since then, reinterpretive approaches to policy studies really became really popular, and they are still, until now, they are one of the most popular approaches in interpretive policy analysis. And a large, and they are part of interpretive methods such as discourse analysis, frame analysis, narrative analysis, and so on. So some of these methods have become accepted as a kind of tool to analytic practice in policy making even and interpretation of policies. To the point that even now we have a journal that is called Critical Policy Studies, and of course a significant amount of conferences dedicated just to critical policy analysis, including those that use IPA. Yet again, as you can see, this quotation here from Professor Dvorayanov, this interpretive approach to policy really take a focus on meanings of policies and values and feelings and beliefs that are expressed through those policies. So that's why this shift not only at outcomes that certain policies have had, but what those policies really meant and what kind of values they have had represented. And from the perspective of policy analysis, this meant really the shift, focusing on the symbolic artifacts. For example, language, objects, but also acts and their influence within the policy space on policymakers and then on policies. So this slide shows you a conceptual model of interpretive policy analysis. So we in IPA look not only on language, but also at, on objects, on acts and meanings of those, and then what kind of values, beliefs, and feelings those meanings embody, if you like, and then how they are again represented in language, objects, and acts, which of course includes, but it's not limited to, policies themselves. So I would like to move on a little bit now to how actually in practice you may conduct interpretive policy analysis. And there are really 4 basic steps in policy analysis listed on this slide. And as I said, as I mentioned before, typically interpretive policy analysis strongly emphasizes qualitative research method, such as interpretation of documents and ethnographies of documents, policy documents, discourse analysis, and so on, but also may include quantitative research. And there are these 4 basic steps in IPA, as shown on the slide, but how one does or takes rather those steps in practice. So what we do in interpretive policy analysis, first we consider the category of language, which includes, for example, looking at metaphors, but also we do category analysis. In some sense, this part of IPA is similar to critical discourse analysis, where we look at use of basically where we follow Fairclough's way of analyzing text. So we use that sort of mood, but also thematic structure of text, nominalizations, and so on. Then we conduct analysis, close analysis of those metaphors, mainly because they provide us with an opportunity to analyze perspective of policymakers. So use of metaphors is not accidental and also carry certain meanings. So when we analyze interviews with policymakers, the ways in which they use metaphors about the policies or political situation that they are describing tells a lot about their perspective on what's going on and what they would like to this particular individual that's interview or the political party would like to introduce in policy. Then we go further and we perform category analysis. And then in this part, we really consider language use to put objects or people in specific category. So let's say if we are talking about social welfare policies, the ways in which policymakers speak about who is, let's say, entitled to universal credit and who is not, tells us a lot about how this policy and or policymaker, if we are interviewing a policymaker and use this text for our analysis, categorize this people. For example, as deserving to access universal credit or undeserving. We go down further and we identify categories that are important to individuals or groups that are part of the study. So yet again, by interviewing, keeping this example of universal credit, we can identify categories of individuals within this access to universal credit. Who can access it, who cannot, under what kind of conditions and when. Looking at this, identifying these categories helps us to see how policymakers perceive society. And here, all of people who research social class and so on will have a plethora of analytical tool to find specific categories that are embedded in policies, regardless of the subject. It doesn't have to, of course, be universal credit. Then we perform classic narrative analysis, and here we consider stories told in policymaking, in policies themselves, but also by policymakers. And
Hi, Prasanna. Are you still there? We've lost your sound. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can now.
Sorry, I don't know. No idea. So I was talking about then we move, after identifying categories, we can move to performing narrative analysis. And those are really interesting, especially if we want to analyze political debates on certain subjects or minutes from political gatherings and so on. So this narrative analysis really considers stories told to communicate information regarding the policy. And those are fantastic, this narrative analysis in IPA for interviews, when analyzing interviews with policymakers and politicians. And researchers that perform IPA should really remember that the purpose, a final purpose of narrative and those stories that are being told is to present a specific point of view, right? So they are not accidental, but they are designed in order to present specific point of view on a specific issue, let's say social issue, and then what kind of solutions are proposed by certain political group or certain policy makers, and then by analyzing those, we can also see what kind of values they represent. We also consider symbolic objects, and symbolic objects may include even building spaces. So I don't know, Department of Work and Pension building in London, those can be analyzed, and lots of geographers, and especially urban geographers, analyze those objects in order to see a context within which policy was created. And we talk about this context, the importance of context before. But also specific programs, so set of policies in one program can be considered as symbolic objects as well and analyzed as such. So after performing this kind of analysis, and I'll show you an example later on, we can perform additional steps. And this brings me back a little bit to Alan's presentation and how we can have perhaps impact and how our research can have impact. So here we can show different meanings and interpretations for how policies were formulated and how they are enacted, and with what consequences, within which context. So basically we can contest here certain policies, and those contestation and proposed changes can be, for example, presented in policy briefs and then presented to policymakers or certain NGOs working on specific issues and so on. So basically we can lobby for change and communicate our research to several different types of organizations through looking at these meanings and interpretation for policy formulation and or action shown on the slide. We can also, as next step, show the different ways of seeing certain phenomena by different groups of interest. So basically we can expose those values who are often not necessarily working for each and every or group. So we can expose those, and then by presenting this, we can yet again lobby for a change and perhaps have influence on policy change in the future. And then the last point, the 7th point, in terms of additional step, we can bringing all previous steps and showing them preferably in short form, like policy brief yet again. We can potentially negotiate, mediate, or intervene in some form to bring difference if our research shows that the difference in policies and policy in practice is needed. Of course, that's easier said than done. But now I will talk briefly about my research, in which I and my colleagues used this methodology and the ways in which we try at least to have an impact with our research. So I will talk about transfer projects. This project was funded by Norface, which is New Opportunities for Research Funding Agency Corporation in Europe. And in this research, my colleagues and I, we focused on portability of social security rights in enlarged European Union. So I can say that this included UK, which made historical research rather. And we look at rights such as the right to health insurance, the rights to unemployment, retirement, family-related benefits, for example, child and maternity benefits. So the idea of portability of social security rights is the one that citizen can one country to the other within EU and port their social security rights, of course, providing of course under certain conditions to they do move from country A to country B in order to find employment, in short. So the aim of this study was to really reconstruct regulatory pathways to portability of this for this migrant category. So for different types of migrants, remember I spoke about categories before, which would make visible the processes and gateways which open or close portability. And really we wanted to assess logic of selectivity in those regulatory pathways. In other words, we wanted to assess how policies surrounding portability of social security rights and you can see this on this slide, at national level, but also EU level and cross-country, because we work with 4 country pairs in the EU, how and if and under what condition those policies surrounding portability of social security rights created a logic of selectivity. So basically, who is allowed to move, when, why, and what are the conditions for those people to access what one could think of a granted right to porting social security rights. So with a broad interpretive policy approach, the research strategy was developed with really with a view or with a goal to identifying this regulatory and institutional conditions which shaped these pathways to portability regulation. In practice, we wanted to explore how those may be different across different categories of migrants across country pairs. And we have 4 country pairs. So we look at Poland, UK, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, Germany, Estonia, and Sweden. So really constructive analysis, and we use this interpretive policy analysis because it required highly contextualized and reflexive treatment of these legal regulations. We didn't want it to just look at regulations and say person A can move to country B when they are under this and that condition. Yes, we explored that, and it was important information for us, but we wanted to highly contextualize that, and also, as I said, have this reflexive treatment of formal legal regulations. And that's why we have chosen to perform interpretive policy analysis. So, research design, which is presented really on this slide, was oriented to generate data on procedures, but also on perception of those procedures from policymakers across these 8 countries. So we've done that, and also we analyzed the political situation in each and every country at the point when those policies were introduced, and at the point when the research was made. So there are 2 points in time. We've done that in order to illuminate and really compare this implicit and hidden logic and rationalities, which really underpin the idea behind this portability of social security rights in the European Union. So we had to do that. So I'm trying to show how IPA helps in looking at really large context of our research. So for doing that, we had to compare several dimensions of portability regulations. And this was across 4 country pairs. And wait a minute, I have somewhere now because we look at, so yeah. So in terms of regulations, we look at 4 policy areas, more than 50 benefits categorized by type, 8 country cases, 4 pair of countries, and we applied all of this to 3 migrant categories, so one-time migrant, returning, and settler migrant. And on top of that, we supplemented our analysis of regulations with team informant interviews. So there are people working, really street-level bureaucrats, if you like, working, for example, in unemployment offices across the 8 countries and so on, and expert interviews. And expert interviews included policymakers responsible for policies surrounding portability of social security rights in these 8 countries. And all of this on top of that, in order to really have this broad context needed for IPA, we supported all of it by country context briefing papers and statistical data. So we use both quantitative and qualitative data. And this helped us to produce comparative transnational tables of regulatory conditions by all benefits and across 3 migrant categories. So now you can see the reason why I'm listing this is the fact, the reason why I'm listing it is because I want to show you this high contextualized nature of IPA, which is important because that's what's different between critical discourse analysis and IPA. And here I have to stress that critical discourse analysis are used in IPA as well, but all of this is supported by all of those other informations as well. So just to briefly, those are like few reflections and findings, but I will list methodological supplement. We had to publish actually methodological supplements about the ways in which we've done this research, because it was fairly complicated and highly, of course, contextualized. But it helped us to understand this difference between what policy was designed for at EU level and what was going on in practice in each and every country that we look at. And therefore, this the idea behind this portability of social security rights was this idea itself of portability of social security rights was designed by EU to make especially unskilled workers being able to move frequently across countries, where in EU, wherever there's demand for labor. However, we showed that in practice, it's just completely opposite, and those policies and regulations, or those regulations at EU level, created or influenced the ways in which policies across European countries were designed that promoted the sedentarist way of living, meaning that EU workers moved anyway, most likely from one country to the other once, in order to retain and access social security rights through their really work. So how about limitation? I hope you can see this. So how about limitations of IPA? Well, as always with any methodology or umbrella of methodologies rather, like IPA, there are several limitations, but the most important limitations to IPA is the fact that usually we work with enormous amount of data and different type of data that we try to bring together. So basically, I think the most important limitations of IPA is really time constraint, and also time constraint and the ways the ability to quickly process data. Right, we cannot conduct IPA really quickly. It takes time, but there are also, of course, pluses of this methodology that I hope I showed today in this presentation. I have had two more slides, but I will really skip that. It's one of the methodologies, sub-methodologies used in IPA. It's called the logics approach, and it's it is a type of discourse analysis that looks at in speeches, but also in policies themselves, in debates, minutes, and so on. Through this methodology, researchers are spotting social logics, political logics, and phantasmatic logics. And I'll just mention for maybe students that would like to research this further and read about this. This methodology, particular methodology, is fantastic if you want to look at the ways in which policymakers are justifying the need for change in policies, or really any political event that is taking place. So, for example, you could take Brexit here. this phantasmatic logic would be, in this case, let's say, all of the explanation by Conservative Party on how great Britain will be if only Brexit will happen. And looking at those logic helps to underpin kind of the rationality behind policy making and decision making in politics quite clearly. But this would require, I guess, further lecture. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. We had a question from Metka earlier. So Metka, can I invite you to turn on your microphone and ask your question?
Hi, thank you, Deborah. Thank you to all the speakers. My question was around different policies and different policy makers. So on state level, or apparently on EU level as well, you have different structures, even on local policies. Would the same approach methodologically apply to international arena, international context, whereby we have states that are of equal power, but perhaps different structures?
Yes, so that's why, yes, you can do it, and you can do it cross-country even. You can bring the different countries and still compare policies about similar phenomena there, or specific policy. You have to work, for example, on functional equivalence. If you'd like to look at, for example, a specific type of policy, policy making in different countries is clearly different. So sometimes you'll have to work on functional equivalence. So equivalent to a policy in country A, what this equivalent would be in policy B. And of course, you have to then compromise quite a bit. And comparative studies, comparative policy studies are never easy, really. And there's lots of compromises to be made there. But this is also done through this contextualizations, and that's why it takes so much time. So let's say if you'd like to analyze certain policies in UK, and let's say Uganda, the tradition of policy making may be similar, may be different. Certain policies may not have equivalent or have quite some similarities, but some differences. So you need to work out how you'd like to compare them, why, and with what goal. So there's lots of compromises to be made there, and working on equivalence, functional equivalence of policies that you compare.
Can I contribute to that?
Yes, of course.
I had a lot of experience of trying to have an impact internationally. I was president of the global adult education body for 5 years, and you know, one of the things that you have to see is external forces, isn't it? The extent to which the World Bank shapes extremely common responses from very distinctly different countries, and how does that happen, and what can you do to ameliorate it? I mean, there are a series, whether you're talking at a European level or at a global level, I mean, there is the national discourse and how it might have some impact on that. There's the kind of regional networks. One thinks of ADEA in Africa around development policies, where you can see that people come together and work out common lines. There's the incredibly complex processes of the UN, and each of those will have an impact in different ways on different social policy, you know, for analysing different social policy issues. I mean, broadly in my own field in education, you could say that since the Second World War, there's been a core dialogue between the human values focused perspective of UNESCO and a human capital and neoliberal perspective of a whole cluster of bodies like the World Bank, OECD and IMF. And that one of the most interesting things about where we are now is the challenges of artificial intelligence and robotics and so on are shifting the boundaries of which organizations feel that they need to take the positions they have, so that you've got a real difference between global policy aspirations and what's actually happening at a local level. Rich territory for analytical research. The contexts are marginally different, and you need to learn the mechanics, but the same principles of analysis surely play.
Okay, thank you. And Metka has another question if there's time. How easy is it to prove gaps or silence in policy dialogue?
It is a very difficult question because it's difficult to prove, if you like. I think we have to be mindful also that as researchers, even if we want to or not, we do have certain points of view on policies that we analyze. So also what, gaps that you want to look at or find out about may be shaped by your perception of the policy as well. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think we should be reflective on the ways in which and how we are trying to look at those gaps in policies. I'm not sure if I'm replying to your question, Alan, Sarah.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, if you look at things like domestic violence and its absence in public policy in a country like Britain, I mean, the way it happens is people create conditions for the people whose experience has been silenced to be heard, and to make that politically embarrassing enough to join a policy environment. And that can happen at the local, the neighborhood, the national or the international level. But as well as kind of the theater, you then need the really solid evidence about the impact on people's lives. And so, this week, if you look at the coronavirus discourse, the evidence about the numbers of people who've been phoning domestic abuse lines, or the people who've died during the period, they're vivid illustrations of stuff that wasn't on the policy agenda, and you collect the evidence in order to change the dialogue, I think. And you win, and then the system rolls back and you find more evidence and win again. You have to be patient to change the world.
Okay. So thank you very much to our speakers. I'm sure you'll agree it's been an absolutely fascinating afternoon, and I really, really appreciate you all sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. So I'll give you all a round of applause on behalf of everybody. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for everybody who's joined us, and I look forward to seeing you again at other events that we run. I have recorded today, and we will be uploading the recording, and hopefully, if it's okay with the presenters, the slides. Doctoral College website, so that's www.wlv.ac.uk/doctoral. Okay, so thank you everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank
You're
you.
Organization. Frustrating system.
True.